I'm Josh Green, and I'm really happy to be presenting Liz Horowitz of Sonic Strategy and Matt Drengler from Podscribe talking about cracking the code, mastering podcast advertising measurement. So please join me in giving them a big welcome.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Cracking the Code, Mastering Podcast Advertising Measurement. I know that's something that is not easy to crack the code on, so I'm glad that we're here to see if we can help give you some insights. I am Liz Horowitz. I am the founder of Sonic Strategy Consulting, and I am a business growth strategist helping companies who serve the podcast industry with profitability and growth. And my guest here today is Matt Drengler. Matt will tell you more about his work and his background. Matt is the head of revenue for Podscribe, which is the #1 independent company for tracking measurement in podcast advertising today. So we're lucky to have Matt with us, and let's get started.
Thanks, Liz. I appreciate it.
Sure.
Good to see everybody here.
All right. So, Matt, to start, why don't you give us a little bit of background on your expertise in the podcast measurement world and what Podscribe does, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, let's dive in. So for the past 8 or 9 years of my career now, I have been focused on measurement and attribution with a focus primarily on audio and podcasting. It's about 9 years ago, I think about a month ago now, where I started to figure out whether or not you could measure podcast media in a similar way to digital style attribution. The answer is yes, you can do that, by the way, and we'll dive in more. Podscribe is a platform. We focus a lot on fixing a lot of the operational challenges within podcasting, as well as cracking the code on podcast measurement as well. So things like the operational aspect of ensuring that host reads are being read the right way. Are hosts saying the correct vanity URLs and promo codes? Are they being placed in the ads that you expect them to be placed on? Is your reach, your audience reach, what you expect it to be? So on and so forth. And then attribution and incrementality is also a very large part of what we do. Advertisers want to know, did their ads work? And they don't want to rely only on vanity URLs and coupon codes. So that's where we come in.
Okay, thanks for that. So before we get started with our agenda, I'd like to see a raise of hands. How many of you have at any point in time used podcast advertising? Okay, so
That's a great number.
I would say that's about 80%
That's
of
a
our
record
crowd
right there,
today.
yeah?
Yep.
Yeah.
And those of you who haven't, I'm assuming, are anxious to learn more about it so that you may one day soon. So let's go ahead and talk about how brands have had really enormous success with podcast advertising. But as you probably know, this type of success doesn't happen overnight. So Matt, I wonder if you can tell us about the ramping up process and what you think makes a successful strategy when beginning a podcast advertising campaign. What are the basic steps that should be covered?
Yeah, I think the first thing to recognize is, I call it the ad techification of the podcast industry. If we are, as marketers, and especially those of us that are digital marketers, used to having access to things like audience-based targeting, contextual-based targeting, some folks don't necessarily recognize that that is something that is very much so available within podcasting today. So if you're starting to think about how should we dip our toes in podcasting, perhaps just a episodic host-read ad, albeit that's sort of a tried and true method that a lot of folks think about when they think about podcast advertising. That should be one spoke in a number of spokes that an advertiser should try. So yes, a host-read ad where it's very much so felt like it's sort of an endorsement from the host itself, not necessarily an advertisement, absolutely should try that at first. But also leveraging things like contextual-based targeting, as well as audience-based targeting. Doing those things are really important as well because we can find our audience very much so in a lean-in moment within podcasting, since there's a lot of engagement within podcasting, not as much passive listening. And so doing those two things combined, or perhaps three things combined, is a good way to start. And then I think the final way to think about this as well is if we're doing contextual-based targeting or audience-based buying, we can also pay attention to things like brand safety too. So if I were to make a recommendation as a brand, I would definitely be looking at impression-based buying, definitely host-based buying, but also run-of-network buying as well. If you end up buying something that's more run-of-network with a network or with a podcast network, it will allow us to ingest things like what is the host or what is the show name. And when we break out results in the dashboard, you can start to see within this run-of-network buy which podcast seems to pop in terms of my conversion rates, visitation rates, cost per acquired customer, cost per visitor, so on and so forth. That can help inform the next buy. Whether that means I'm going to go and buy directly with that podcast or find podcasts like the ones that popped, it really is a great place to get started and informs what your future strategy and optimizations look like.
So what you're talking about, Matt, is using independent research to help inform the results that you're getting with your podcast buy.
Yes.
So let's talk about what that technology looks like. Just give us a little backgrounder on how this works.
Yeah, so when we're measuring podcast ads, we use pixels, just like digital advertising is using pixels today. Now, it does depend on how an ad is being placed within a podcast. So, I mentioned before that host-read ads are really sort of the tried and true methodology that people think about when advertising in podcasts. And the way that we can ingest that is, we can dive in on the tech, but it's sort of like a click-through tracker if you're a digital marketer, or we call it an RSS prefix. We can ingest that data that way. If we're talking about the impression-based buys, geography or demographic-based buys, we ingest that through a pixel, just like we're used to ingesting things through a pixel in display or paid video or paid social, so on and so forth. And so we ingest that exposure data. Any attribution provider is ingesting exposure data, but also ingesting conversion data in these two disparate databases. So leveraging either a pixel on a website, a server-to-server connection, we can also integrate with all the major MMPs out there to answer questions like, are podcasts driving app downloads or app engagement? And so these types of signals come in, they fill out these two buckets of impressions and conversions, and then that's sort of where the attribution methodology comes into play, starts linking things like conversions back to impressions and answering questions like, are we driving an efficient cost per visitor? What is our return on ad spend? And so on and so forth. So that's sort of how it works, very similar to how we're used to seeing things working within the digital advertising space.
Okay, and sometimes this is offered through a publisher who has contracted with your services.
Absolutely.
Although advertisers can work with you directly, there's a self-serve element
Yeah,
to what Podscribe offers.
Absolutely. I would say there's a self-serve element, but we are still very much so white glove service. We're a small startup. We're less than 15 people. And so, yes, you could work with us, whether getting that attribution sort of for free from a publisher, which is just a great way to dip your toes into this space and not have to have an additional IO associated with this buy. Or if you want more control and direct access to like a support team and stuff like that, working directly with us is a really beneficial way to do that too, especially if you've got questions on, hey, what is the methodology? Or, things as ridiculous as what referrer URLs are you considering when you are attributing conversions back to impressions? So we can help across all of those different things.
So show of hands, how many of you have actually used a pixel-based approach to attribution in podcasting? Okay,
couple.
just a
Okay.
handful.
Right,
What
great.
about vanity URLs?
Okay, yeah.
A few of those as well. Okay, so there's a lot of resources at your fingertips that you may be exposed to today that you haven't had the advantage of using to date that could help you to ramp up your podcast investment simply by seeing more data on how it's performing. So in terms of that performance, let's say a brand is new to the medium. Can they look to recommended benchmarks as far as measurement goes? What do you say to those who ask you to give them some type of benchmark?
Yeah, the nice thing is that on a quarterly basis, we release a new benchmark report. And yes, it provides things like what types of conversion rates or visitation rates to expect, but it also dives in on other specific insights. So, one of the more interesting insights that we see, which is so counterintuitive because we're used to seeing things like, oh, you should start buying 6-second ads. The longer the ad in podcasts, the better it performs. Now, longer ads typically are host-read ads, typically much more the endorsement-read ads. But it still is interesting to see that we have an almost one correlation between time spent with, or ad length, and conversion rate. So that's probably one of the things I would call out here is benchmarks are possible. We release benchmarks on a quarterly basis, and that should give you a really good understanding as to what to expect when you first walk in.
All right, and then as far as trends you're seeing in the podcast industry, what are we seeing on the horizon in terms of the future of attribution?
We could talk about the death of the cookie. Has anyone talked about that at all today? The first thing that I'll call out here is the podcast industry has never had the privilege of leveraging third-party cookies. If you think about your own experience as podcast listeners, or if you're not, a lot of folks use, let's say, the Apple Podcast app, the Spotify app, some type of app to access this content. And third-party cookies don't exist within that. So what that means is any sort of impression or exposure-based data, there are no third-party cookies that could ever be set or accessed or anything like that. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that most podcast attribution providers have recognized that third-party cookies are going away. And so third-party cookies are not a part of the methodology. So once cookies go away, it's not going to, or should I say third-party cookies, because first-party cookies are not going away. We can dive into that more. But third-party cookies going away will not impact results at all because it's not leveraged within the attribution methodology. So that's probably the first thing that I'll call out. The second trend that I'll call out that we see more and more is this difference between an embedded ad, which is a host-read ad that lives in that episode forever, and then these dynamically inserted ads, which is where the impression-based or the audience-based buying starts to come in. Publishers used to offer like 10% of their inventory as dynamically inserted ads. If you fast forward to today, it's like 90% of all the inventory that's being sold within the podcast space. I expect that to continue to go up. However, I do expect to see premiums on the host-read embedded ads to go up. And here's why. Advertisers, we as advertisers love embedded ads because if I download the podcast that was released yesterday, it will have my ad. If I download that podcast again in a year or 2 years, it will still have that ad, even though my campaign flight dates are over. And so that's a massive benefit. But the downside is we have to make sure our call to actions are timeless. So if we have a coupon code that expires in 6 months, you could see how that's not going to go over very well, and that's a fairly poor user experience. So these are some of the trends that I see sort of emerging. I expect and anticipate that I'll use the term again, ad techification will continue to grow within the podcast space for sure.
And I want to call out something that you mentioned before, Matt, which is brand safety.
Yes.
So as we're heading into this political cycle, there's always concerns about brand safety, but maybe that is increasing. And are there any tools that are available to address brand safety?
Yes, there are definitely a lot of tools out there to address brand safety. One of the things that we started to see in the podcast space more and more are folks that look to take the audio or the video of a podcast and transcribe it into something that's more computer readable. That's been happening now for like the past 5 or 6 years. So the data exists to perform some semblance of brand safety analysis. What I will also say too is, I'm sure a lot of you have a favorite comedian. And a lot of the ways that comedians launch podcasts, they say things like, well, I'm not allowed to say most things on stage, so I launched a podcast so I can say whatever I want. And so brand safety is a very, very important topic. And one of the things that we recognize within our own brand safety tools is the context with which how words are being used is incredibly important when trying to identify is something brand safe or not brand safe. If we just do things like keyword targeting, it loses the context. And this is why I think a lot of advertisers, when they first come into the space, they see things like news and politics as a really poor place to start because there's plenty of keywords that are being triggered within news and politics. And when you start to add context to that, which is, hey, they may say some things that aren't brand safe, but it's in a context of educational or newsworthy type topics, not sensationalist or anything like that. Now all of a sudden it opens up the opportunity to put your brand in front of something that is still brand safe, even though typical keyword targeting probably would have marked it as not brand safe. So I think that's probably one of the most important things about podcasts is that we have the context behind some of the things that are traditionally not thought of as brand safe, because podcasts are there's a lot of professional news organizations that create podcasts, but there's also a lot of individuals where they can pretty much say anything that they want. And that's actually the beauty of podcasting. That's why the audience is so engaged and why we see so much success for advertisers that do it the right way, because the audience feels like they're a part of the conversation. So context is very important.
Well, and another thing along those lines that I've heard that advertisers struggle with, so again, show of hands if this is something you have struggled with, and that is finding audiences. How do I find my particular audience? Maybe there's shows that I'm not familiar with or that this particular publisher doesn't offer that address my audience. How do I find that? We call it show discoverability.
Yeah.
So if an advertiser comes to you with that challenge, how do you address it?
Yeah, what I'll say very generally is that there's sort of 3 different ways to look at the audience of a podcast. One is through things like survey results, so you can work with like the Nielsen's of the world who ask some questions around podcast listenership to be able to cross-tab that with like demographics or other answers from things like their Scarborough survey. So that's one way that you can look at it. It is definitely limited to the number of podcasts they have on their survey, obviously, but that's probably one of the better ways to get information. Another way that a lot of folks are trying to provide an audience overlay is by using more like Nielsen Excelate or Experience segments, where we need to overlay things using a digital identifier, right? So we are used to seeing these types of audience overlays where it's an individual level demographic or trait. So simply put, targeting folks like males or females in the podcast space is very challenging. And the reason that it's challenging is because the data that comes in on podcasts is limited in compared to other digital channels. The only thing on the exposure side that podcasts have to work with are IP addresses. And for those of us that don't talk tech, that means it's household level at best. So in order to attach using all of these audience-based databases, male or female, to a podcast audience is nearly impossible. And that's because we see an IP address, and if there is a male and a female present within that household, it will attach itself to both. So we found that overlaying things like Nielsen audiences and other audience data is not as beneficial. We found actually the best place for this data is from the social media presence and profiles of the hosts themselves. The data that's coming in from there is much more indicative of who the audience is and will allow you to get a better understanding of, where does male versus female or other really important individual level demographics over index versus others. And so that's sort of how we think about this, is that we rely on that type of data in order to inform the discoverability of shows. So if you log into a podscribe.com, you can say, I'm looking for this particular audience within this age range, this demographic. You can now start to identify the shows that over-index on those things, and now that's a great starting place to discover specific shows and to buy episodically.
Okay, so all of those discoverability tools are available on your dashboard.
100%, yes.
Okay.
Yes,
okay,
100%.
Great, good to know.
Yeah.
All right, so in closing, if you had to say, how do you crack the code? Would you say it is to use a pixel-based service? Is that the starting point?
I think it's using a pixel-based service and finding ways to ensure that that data can be inserted into your current measurement stack, which is typically how folks are doing it. We all have media mix models or multi-touch attribution models that we're leveraging, and the ability to port that data into your measurement solution is something that we do all day, every day. So I would recommend pixel-based attribution and finding ways to integrate that into your current measurement stack.
All right, sounds good. Thank you, Matt.
Thank you, Liz,
Appreciate
very much.
it.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you for
Appreciate
coming.
it. Thank you.